Snow blasted across the mountainside in violent sheets as the fuselage settled into the ice, the metal groaning under its own broken weight. Inside, a handful of survivors struggled to breathe through the shock. The impact had come so fast and so brutally that most of them had no memory of the moment the plane slammed into the Andes. One moment they had been teammates, friends, young men flying toward a rugby match. The next, the aircraft had ripped open, the wings torn away, passengers thrown into the snow, and the cold rushing in like a living force, determined to finish what the crash had started. The wind howled through the shattered cabin. For a few minutes, no one moved. Nando Parado opened his eyes slowly, unsure of where he was or how much time had passed. His head throbbed. A deep cut ran along his scalp, and the cold felt like it was freezing the blood in his veins. He tried to sit up and felt his body resist. Beside him lay his friend, equally stunned, both half buried in torn seats and scattered luggage. The silence inside the fuselage was broken only by the moans of those who had survived the initial impact. Nando forced himself upright, blinking at the jagged wall of snow where the cockpit once was. The front of the plane was gone, buried somewhere beneath tons of ice. He began calling out for the others, his voice cracking in the thin air. A few of his teammates answered weakly. Many others didn't respond at all. Some lay still, their bodies twisted by the violence of the crash. Nando crawled toward the nearest survivor, feeling the cold seep through his clothing. The temperature was dropping fast. The sun had begun to sink behind the jagged peaks, casting long shadows across the valley. There was no shelter beyond the torn-open fuselage, no rescue visible anywhere in the endless field of white. The realization hit them with a force as heavy as the crash itself. They were stranded in one of the most unforgiving places on Earth. As night fell, the survivors huddled together in the narrow shell of the plane, using torn seats and scraps of insulation to block the worst of the wind. The cold was almost unbearable. Their breath froze in the air. Their fingers lost color. Many drifted in and out of consciousness, unsure if they would wake again. When morning came, the snowfall had slowed, but the cold remained. They took stock of what little they had: a few chocolate bars, some wine, and bits of food scattered from luggage. It wasn't enough for one day, let alone the weeks it might take for a search team to find them. They rationed every crumb. They melted snow for water. They organized themselves, forcing order into a situation that seemed designed to break them. But even as they tried to stay strong, hope flickered. A radio they salvaged crackled with news from the outside world. At first, the survivors listened eagerly, waiting for the announcement that search planes were closing in. Instead, they heard something that hit them harder than the crash. The rescue operation had been suspended. The authorities believed no one could have survived at that altitude and in that cold. They had been declared dead. The cabin fell silent. The men stared at one another, the weight of the words sinking in. They were truly alone. If they wanted to live, they would have to save themselves. The days that followed tested them more than they could have imagined. Hunger gnawed at them relentlessly. Their bodies weakened. Frostbite crept into fingers and toes. Some of the injured faded, slipping away during the long nights when even their combined warmth could not fight the cold. The living wrapped the dead in clothing and placed them outside to keep the space inside the fuselage free. Each loss sharpened the truth. The mountains would kill them all unless they found a way out. Food became the dividing line between life and death. With no supplies left, the survivors faced a decision that none of them had ever imagined making. Surrounded by the bodies of their friends, they confronted the impossible. Nando and the others understood that if they didn't find the courage to do what their instincts rejected, no one would make it out. The choice was brutal, but so was the environment around them. The dead could no longer be saved. the living still had a chance. Snowstorms battered the fuselage, pushing drifts against the open end and burying the world around them in layers of white that erased any sign of direction. When an avalanche roared down the mountain one night, it slammed into the fuselage with such force that the entire cabin filled with snow. The survivors clawed toward the surface, gasping for air, fighting panic in the pitch-black darkness. Several were crushed or suffocated before they could be pulled free. The remaining survivors emerged into the frozen night shaking, terrified by how close they had come to dying again. In the aftermath, something hardened inside Nando Parado. He knew they could not remain in the mountains waiting for help that wasn't coming. The only way out was through the snow-covered peaks towering miles above them. He studied the landscape every day, memorizing the shapes of ridges and valleys in the distance. He trained his body despite hunger and exhaustion, preparing for a climb that seemed impossible. With him was Roberto Canessa, equally determined to push beyond the valley that had trapped them. When the weather finally cleared, Nando and Roberto gathered what little supplies they had, wrapped themselves in layers of clothing scavenged from the dead, and stepped out into the blinding snow. The others watched from the fuselage entrance, unsure if they would ever see them again. The climb was brutal from the beginning. The air thinned with each step. Their hands and feet went numb. The snow beneath them shifted unpredictably, threatening to swallow them into hidden crevasses. But they kept moving, inching upward along the steep face of the mountain. When they reached the summit after days of climbing, they expected to see valleys leading into civilization. Instead, they faced an endless horizon of snow-covered peaks stretching as far as they could see. For a moment, despair threatened to break them. But Nando forced himself to keep going. Somewhere beyond those mountains had to be life. They descended into lower valleys, navigating ice fields and frozen slopes. They walked until their legs trembled. They slept in shallow pits carved into the snow. After more than a week of relentless marching, they spotted something they hadn't seen in nearly 3 months: grass. The sight filled them with a warmth neither had felt since before the crash. As they continued, they saw a river, then distant shapes: shepherds. When the men reached them, barely able to speak, the shepherds realized who they must be. Help rushed up the mountains, and the nightmare in the fuselage came to an end at last. 16 survivors were airlifted from the Andes, all because 2 men refused to die in the snow. Thank you for listening to horrifying survival stories. Subscribe for more unbelievable true stories of survival.